And welcome to another live stream from the Great American Mail, the Florida and Georgia lawyer that interprets the issues and news of the day through the law, the Constitution, and history. This live stream is about the Independent State Legislature Doctrine. You're hearing a lot of freaking out there on the left. They're saying it's radical, it's crazy, it's a Republican takeover of elections, it's the Eastman theory, Donald Trump tried to use it. And it's all crazy. Folks, nothing could be further from the truth. As per usual, you're being hoaxed. You're being told the opposite of what the truth is. So I thought I'd come on and do another live stream. First time in a while. We haven't done something about January 6th. Glad to be a little bit away, giving it a little bit of a break for January 6th. If you're watching this and you enjoy it, please share it with friends. Please subscribe. Sharing is caring. It helps content creators like the Great American Mail and others out. So we would greatly appreciate that. So it all starts with Article 1, Section 4, Clause 1, all right? Now, we all know, because those of us that care about the Constitution and the American culture, we all know that Article 1 concerns the legislature. And we're going to read it here. We've got it pulled up, the Constitution annotated here. The times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. But the Congress may, at any time, by law, make or alter such regulations, except as to the places of choosing senators. Now, you would think this says what it says is pretty unremarkable, right? But I'm going to tell you what's going on here. But before we do that, let's go, as we always do, we go to left-wing sites. We debunk them with their own media, with their own press. We do not go to sources that back constitutional governance. So here's what you're hearing from a lot of people about the Independent State Legislature Doctrine, because the Supreme Court has decided to take a North Carolina case and are going to decide this issue again. Let's take a listen to the freak out, and then we're going to back up, explain to you what's going on so you're aware of the issue and understand that it's nothing but them, again, hoaxing us to try to get more power taken away from Republicans.
While today ends this year's term, the court agreed to hear one case from North Carolina for next term that could have potentially cataclysmic repercussions. The Washington Post writes, quote, the Supreme Court on Thursday said it will consider what would be a radical change in the way federal elections are conducted, giving state legislatures sole authority to set the rules for contests, even if their actions violated state constitutions and resulted in extreme partisan gerrymandering for congressional seats. Even if their actions violated state constitutions. This case is about North Carolina, but if the conservative justices rule in favor of the Republicans, it could have an outsized impact, because Republicans control both houses of state legislatures in 30 states. Joining us now is Dahlia Lithwick, senior
editor. All right, before we get to Dahlia Lithwick, and she's just a loony. Anyway, let me explain what's going on here. Okay, and there's a couple things you need to understand that happened that are the reason the court is coming back to this. In 2019, the court decided a case and says, hey, look, partisan gerrymandering shouldn't be done, but it's a political question. The court shouldn't get involved. And so then, of course, the Democrats go, okay, so we go to the state courts to get them involved. If you've been following the election of 2020 and the redistricting battle, as of course I have. In fact, I'll go over to our Substack page. This is our Substack page, GreatAmericanMail.substack.com. This is an article you'll see there from February 26th where we talked about this very issue. Right back in February, we saw this coming for what it was. That gentleman there is Mark Elias. We're going to talk about him in a minute. But getting back to the point. So we all know in 2020, the Democrats, when they had the executive, right, they changed the voting laws, and they had an election where they did not follow the election laws set up by the legislature. Okay, we also know that when redistricting started, because every 10 years you have to redistrict, they said that Republicans control 30 districts, Democrats only control 17, and 3 are split 50-50. So that means that Republicans have an advantage when it comes to redistricting. All right, and so we looked at this back in February, and this is what I told you then was going on. Same thing that happened in the election. This gentleman here, I'm circling right there, Mark Elias, he's been the Democrat general counsel for every Democrat presidential campaign going back to the Clintons, okay? And I'm talking Bill Clinton. So, and he was the architect of all those changes in 2020. What's going on is this little grift we talked about here is even though the legislatures, they were controlled by majority Republicans, and you could see in this article that I talk about here, the premise is well, let's start back. Redistricting is in process, happens every 10 years based on the census, which occurs in the same time frame. The most recent census was completed in 2020. once the results are certified, states legislatures draw congressional districts for the congressional seats for their respective states. Based on the migration of Americans to red states and the Republicans' advantage in the state legislatures, 30-17, Republicans were expected to gain an electoral advantage in the House seats via the bipartisan practice of gerrymandering, right? And I say here, the premise is unremarkable. You can find ample examples of Democrats were complaining in February, hey, the Republicans are going to pick up extra seats because of this stuff. And if you go to the article, you can click on it, and you'll see I pulled up the New York Times saying they're going to gain heavily in the House, and the Guardian, same point. Okay, it's pretty unremarkable. All right. Now, what's happened as a result of redistricting? Well, as a result of this man, Mark Elias, and you'll see here, he's complaining about the radical independent state legislature theory. It's radical, right? We looked at it. Here it is. That's where it comes from, that clause. Doesn't seem too radical to me. Looks to me like the state legislatures, unless overridden by Congress, which they can't do because they can't get past the filibuster. So it looks to me like they should set the ways elections are charged. By the way, they also do the same thing for the electors. So that's why this is important. So let's go take a look at 538. Again, we use left-wing sources. Very, very left-wing source here. They're not quite finished. We've got a few little things percolating out there, but we're almost finished with redistricting. And here you go, folks, right here. Proof is positive. Change from the old maps. We have 6 more Democrat-leading seats and 6 less highly competitive seats. Now, the Republicans still have an advantage, to be sure, 208 to 187. That means it has to be Republican-leaning or Democrat-leaning. It has to have a +2 lean one way or another. And it doesn't mean you can't win a +2 district. You can, but it's more difficult, all right? And then you have 40 highly competitive seats. Story for another time. This has been getting worse, continually worse over the years. That's why you see people like Adam Schiff in Congress, because they can't get unelected. But I digress. The point of this story that I want to tell you is when I wrote that article, I was complaining then about this guy, Mark Elias, was going to courts. And what's he doing? Well, when the legislature draws the map, he goes, oh, well, I don't like this map since I can't go to federal courts anymore, although he'll still do that, and Democrats will get involved when they shouldn't. He runs to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, which is very, very Democrat. When the North Carolina legislature, which is very Republican, draws a map, he runs to the North Carolina Supreme Court, which is very, very left, and then they strike it down. So basically, folks, what's going on here is that the Democrats have pushed it so far, once again, they just fly in the face of what's going on in reality. Republicans should have picked up seats here. They should have had more Republican-leaning seats as a result of them having more legislatures, but it didn't work out that way. In fact, because of Elias and his maneuvering to go and get these Supreme Courts in states like North Carolina and Pennsylvania to strike down the map and make them go back and make it more Democrat-friendly, they actually picked up seats. Now, what do you think happened when this happened? They also did it with the elections, folks. And remember that? For example, I'm broadcasting from Atlanta, Georgia right now. You'll remember that after the election, a lot of states did this. They passed new laws and they said, hey, look, we're not doing mail-in balloting. We're not doing no excuse absentee ballots. We're not doing that. And that was called, oh, that's Jim Crow 2.0. You can't do that. You can't do that. It's exactly what's happening here, is that the Republicans are just pushing back and going, look, you're going too far. The Constitution says that state legislatures said it. Now, let's get back to this because I want to hear a little bit more of the lunacy on MSNBC. But remember he said there, he quoted from the Washington Post, again, a left-wing site, that said, even if it's unconstitutional. Well, who said it was unconstitutional? The only reason it's unconstitutional is because the radical leftist Democrat state Supreme Court in North Carolina and places like Pennsylvania said it was. And all they're doing is basically, folks, just understand, and we're going to get to her in a moment, you're going to see, all they're saying is, we want the Democrats to make the decision. But it's not, you don't control the legislature there. Man, no problem. We'll just appeal the map and say it's unconstitutional and get the state Democrat Supreme Court to do it. That's not proper, folks. It's not proper at all. Anyway, take a listen to her.
Good to see you. Thanks for making time for us tonight.
See if she can debunk anything I've said.
What was your reaction when you learned that the court would be taking up this case from North Carolina about state legislatures having absolute power over elections and that courts can't get involved in decisions made by the legislature, even if those decisions seem to be counter to the Constitution?
Yeah, this was the thermonuclear option. This was the thing we've all been waiting to see if the court was going to take up. And I think you've described it perfectly. I mean, this was more or less the theory that was being pushed by John Eastman and Jeffrey Clark and the folks who were asking to set aside the results of the 2020 election. So the idea that the court is now agreeing to take it up in advance of the 2024 election. We know, by the way, that there's already 4 justices who have signaled in various cases that have come before it. There's already 4 justices who are kind of on board with this. So the idea that the court is teeing this up in advance of 2024 is pretty bone-chilling.
Well, let's talk about.
So okay. And again, this is what they do all the time. It's bone-chilling. It's the same as January 6th. Everything's January 6th. If it's not Putin's fault, it's January 6th's fault. Okay? She doesn't explain anywhere in there why this shouldn't mean the legislature. They also say, well, what they're doing is unconstitutional. Well, who proves that? Let's go, before we let her talk, because she's going to say one other thing I want to cover real quick, and then I'm going to wrap it up. But this is the New York Times. Let's read the New York Times case, okay? The Supreme Court announced Thursday it would hear a case that would radically reshape how federal elections are conducted by giving state legislatures independent power, not subject to review by the state courts, to set election rules in conflict with state constitutions. That is not what they said. The Independent State Legislature Doctrine is basically going to say, absent something radical, you should let the legislature decide who chooses the how you choose senators and how you choose representatives and how you choose your electoral college electors. Now, they frame that as though people are doing radical, crazy things. They were doing no such thing. In the 2019 Supreme Court case was 5-4. But you remember Ruth, that was before Ruth died. It would be 6-3 if they ruled the same way, which basically they said at that point, this is not the business of courts. They never said you could just violate your Constitution. What they said is courts shouldn't come in and under the guise of claiming that you're violating the Constitution, set it aside. The case has the potential to affect many aspects of the 2024 election. Folks, I've already showed you, right? It has the effect of affecting the 2022 election because right there, see? They picked up 6. They should have lost by 4 or 5. You should have 4 or 5 more leaning Republican. And instead, they rigged the system by running to these Democrat courts. And all that's happening is the Republicans are finally going, look, you took it too far, as per usual. We're going to go back to the Constitution. And these people are saying it's the opposite, right? Anyway, including giving the justices power to influence the presidential rates if disputes arise over how many state courts interpret the state election laws. In taking up the case, the court could nearly upend every facet of American electoral process, allowing state legislatures to set new rules, regulations, and districts on federal elections with few checks against overreach and potentially create a chaotic system with differing rules and voting eligibility for presidential elections. That is completely made up and fabricated. No one's talking about doing this. And you'll notice, folks, they didn't cite any cases. They don't bring up any cases. Where are the cases where the court struck them down because they were trying to say black people can't vote? Or you got to guess how many gumballs are in this jar before you can vote. They don't have any of that. Well, all what happened was they would draw a map, right, that would be more favorable to the Republican, and Mark Elias would sue him, and then he would, of course, if it was in you had a conservative Supreme Court, he would go to the federal court and find a Democrat judge. And that's, again, if you go check out my article, you can read all about this in greater detail. Anyway, so let's go a little further here. The Supreme Court's decision will be enormously significant for presidential elections, congressional elections, and congressional districting. I think he means redistricting, said Michael Luddick, a former federal appeals court judge, and therefore for American democracy. And again, that's the same Luddick that testified in the January 6th committee. He's supposedly a conservative. Please, he's nothing conservative about him. Anyway, so it goes down and they talk currently, if you scroll down, currently Republicans have complete control over 30 legislatures, right? Democrats only have 10. So what's happening here, again, they basically admit everything if you give them time, is that they're just mad because the people are voting for Republicans who are then supposed to set the rules, and they don't like that. And they've managed to somehow in North Carolina and Pennsylvania and other places manage to run to the Supreme Courts, which are Democrat controlled, and overrule that. And that's what's happening in North Carolina. It's a very leftist Supreme Court there in North Carolina. So anyway, one other thing I want you to see from this article is right here. When the doors close, when the court closed the doors for federal courts to claims of partisan gerrymandering in Rucho v. Common Cause in 2019, Chief Justice John G. Roberts Jr., writing for the 5 most conservative members of the court, said state courts could continue to hear such cases, including in the context of congressional districting. Here's the problem, folks. He basically said the federal court shouldn't be doing this. He did leave it open for the state courts to continue to do it. And here's the problem. What they did was inappropriate. What they did was they then did what the federal courts were doing, getting involved in gerrymandering, and under the guise of claiming it violates the state constitution, basically allowing the Supreme Court, or in some cases the governor, to draw the legislative districts, and that's never been appropriate. But again, when the Republicans come in and say, look, we're going to put it back to the way it's supposed to be, Democrats always cry foul. So here you go. Take a listen to this. I wanted to hear you this, and then we'll be finished. I think you've got the idea.
Talk about this for a second. The idea is that the courts are there, if they're operating properly, to have a check on when there's legislation that is challenged because it is deemed to be unconstitutional. What's the logic behind a case like this? What's the logic behind saying the courts can't have a role even if the states do something that's wrong?
I think you're making the mistake of trying to find logic. This is a profound misreading of, an opinion in Bush v. Gore that only garnered 3 votes. It's a profound misreading of the word legislature. This is another one of those ideas that kind of comes up from, the bowels of the kind of far, far, far reaches of the conservative legal movement. It has no actual salience. It's just really, I think, a totally instrumental way to give state legislatures the power to override the judiciary. And I think that, we can talk for hours.
Anyway, I just wanted you to hear that part. I mean, nothing you've not heard one single solitary thing in here that debunks anything I've said, that article in that Constitution says the legislature. It's always been understood. In recent years, the legislatures have been assaulted. They were assaulted in 2020 when governors in red states, that had red state legislatures, the governor was blue. They just wrote the rules again for how you elect people. They're doing the same thing with gerrymandering. Read that article. It'll give you some more information. And again, here's all you need to know from 538. Even though Republicans had a big advantage and should have come out of this with a big advantage, they ended up being down 6. Now, to make you feel a little bit better, I believe when I wrote the article in February, the Democrats were up like 10 or 11. So it ended up getting cut into, and it wasn't as big advantage as it was. But this is what they always do. When they rig the system somehow to benefit them, and then when you put it back together, they claim that you're doing something unconstitutional or radical. And never forget with these people, they never go back to the cases. They never go back to anything. They just attack you. Like trying to come up with logic. What could possibly be the logic? I mean, there couldn't possibly be any logic where the legislature's supposed to do it, and then if the Supreme Court of the particular state goes rogue and just substitutes their opinion for the legislature, there can't be anything logical about that. That's just insane. That's crazy. Anyway, if you enjoyed this, again, please subscribe it. Sharing is caring. Let a friend know about the channel, and tune back in for some more things we'll be doing. Again, we do a live podcast every day. You're welcome to tune in for that, and we'll continue to do legal and other issues of the news of the day through the law, the Constitution, and history.